Senator Xenophon.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I would like to speak tonight on an incredibly serious issue that goes to the heart of aviation safety in Australia. In May last year, the Senate Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport References Committee handed down a damning report into the Aviation Transport Safety Bureau's investigation of the ditching of Pell Air Flight VH-NGA off Norfolk Island in 2009. At the outset, I want to acknowledge the excellent work of the committee secretariat in this inquiry. I also want to acknowledge the contribution of Senator David Fawcett, that's you, Mr Acting Deputy President, for whose experience and expert knowledge were invaluable to the other committee members, and I'm very grateful for that, as were the rest of the committee. I'd also like to thank the individuals involved in the incident and their advocates and representatives for the time and effort they spent to ensure the committee fully understood the events of that night and their implications. Brian Ahern and Mick Quinn, experts in aviation safety with distinguished careers in aviation, deserve recognition. Mr Quinn is a former Deputy Director of CASA. Mr Ahern is an independent aviation safety expert that is also very highly regarded. And I note that the report makes reference to the committee had strong concerns about the methodology the ATSB used to attribute risk. And I quote from the committee's report: The methodology appears to defy common sense by not asking whether the many issues that were presented to the committee in evidence but not included in the report or not included in any detail could, firstly, help prevent such an accident in the future, offer lessons in the wider aviation industry, or thirdly, enable a better understanding of actions taken by the crew. And that is just indicative of the abject failures of the ATSB in investigating that accident. The Senate committee, it was also incredibly distressing to hear during the committee process of the physical and emotional impacts on these individuals, and I hope that they will be fully vindicated soon. This inquiry, the Senate inquiry, was not an attempt to reinvestigate the circumstances of ditching. Instead, it focused on the ATSB investigative process and how that process was reflected in the ATSB's findings regarding VH-NGA. The Senate committee's report, in my view, sets out how the pilot of the Pell Air flight on that fateful night was, in effect, in my view, made a scapegoat by the ATSB. What the committee discovered was that the ATSB had appeared to give little consideration to systemic failures and instead laid most of the blame at the pilot of the flight, Dominic James. A key feature of the world's best practice accident investigation is not to look at the actions of the individuals, but the environment in which those actions took place, something that you well know, Mr Acting Deputy President, with a distinguished career as a test pilot. But by doing so, investigators can establish the flaws in the system so that they aren't repeated. Instead, what the Senate committee discovered was that while the ATSB was aware of systemic failures, poor fatigue management and flight planning systems on the part of Pell Air, the operator, they largely ignored these in favour of focusing on the actions of the pilot, Dominic James. I spent a lot of time with Mr James before and during the inquiry, and he's the first one to tell you that, yes, he made some mistakes that night. But would he have made those same mistakes if the company he was working for had insisted on proper rest for its pilots and ensured that they had appropriate tools for flight planning? Common sense says no, he wouldn't, but the ATSB seems to differ. What is even more concerning is that a document came to light during the inquiry that revealed CASA was aware of significant regulatory breaches within Pell Air and also aware of their own failures to enforce those regulations. CASA, despite a memorandum of understanding with the ATSB that required them to share this information, did not do so. The committee's recommendations cover a significant number of issues, among them the ATSB's investigative processes, the classification and regulatory oversight of aeromedical flights, the provision of weather information and the application of the MOU between the ATSB and CASA. The committee also raised concerns about the ATSB's decision not to retrieve the flight data recorders from the ditched plane, despite the ATSB's responsibilities under the International Civil Aviation Organisation's Annex 13 ruling. The committee was so concerned with Mr Dolan's comments on this front that it stated in the report, and I quote from page 30, Mr Dolan's evidence in this regard is questionable and has seriously eroded his standing as a witness before the committee. Mr Acting Deputy President, this is an incredibly strong statement in regards to a senior public servant. I do not understand how Mr Dolan's position in the ATSB is tenable. And yet neither the previous nor the current government have yet formally responded to the committee's report, but I understand it's forthcoming shortly. The ATSB's response to this report has been to commission Canada's Transport Safety Board to undertake a review of the ATSB's investigative process, with particular reference to the Pell investigation and 2 other incidents. However, it emerged in Senate estimates just last week that the Canadian TSB has only reviewed the investigation on the documents. They have not interviewed the individuals involved in the incident and those individuals that provided extensive evidence, such as I understand it, Mr Quinn and Mr Ahern. Although those individuals are critical, very critical of the ATSB's processes, they have also not spoken to members of the Senate committee or even to CASA, as I understand it. Given the many issues regarding oversight and transparency that were raised in the committee report, this is incredibly concerning. It is hard to understand how the Canadian TSB can produce a useful or meaningful view without digging further than the surface documents. This should not be a tick-and-flick exercise. The people involved in this incident, the pilot Dominic James, the co-pilot, the patient and her husband on the aeromedical flight, Mr and Mrs Curral, the doctor and the nurse, Karen Casey, have had their lives permanently affected. Their suffering has been significant, in particular for Ms Casey, who cannot go back to her work as a nurse, and they all deserve better. The Canadian TSB needs to be given carte blanche to examine papers, interview witnesses and interested parties, and to release its report to the public. The fact that it has not done so to date concerns me greatly. There has been more than enough pushed under the carpet in this case. My fear, Mr Acting Deputy President, is that the Canadian TSB may unwittingly be involved in what could end up being a whitewash on behalf of the ATSB. It is time to accept the mistakes that have been made, because without accepting those mistakes, we cannot learn. And if we cannot learn, then we cannot change. And that will be a tragedy in every sense of the word. No lives were lost in the Pell incident due to the great skill of the pilot and some good luck. But unless these systemic issues, a lack of transparency, a lack of regulatory oversight, a desire to protect instead of expose, are addressed, we cannot guarantee that no lives will be lost in the future, and that would be the greatest tragedy of all.